Hey, Christie, you remember that Saturday Night Live thing? Gosh, it was a long time ago. I think it was Rod Schneider. He had the Richmeister. Come on,
I'm not
Christie.
sure you're throwing this out. You didn't prep me for this,
Christie
Jeff.
Meister making copies, right? Well, there is no copy for Larry Levine, so hold on to your butts. We'll be right back after this.
Hi, Christie.
Hi, Jeff.
We're recording now.
The many hours of conversation you and I have had,
Yeah.
we've had probably half of them that haven't been recorded.
You know what we should do? We should start a podcast.
You think? Let's call it the why and the buy. How's
All
that?
right.
And welcome back to the Why and the Buy podcast. Christie, it feels like forever since we've done this. It's only been like, 6 days?
I think. They all run together these days.
Well, I don't know how long it's been, but it doesn't matter because what we've got today is going to absolutely delight our listeners. I've been looking forward to this podcast interview since I scheduled it, a month ago. I don't know. Larry, you and I connected on LinkedIn. We've been connected now for a few years, but I mean, we really had an actual offline conversation, which is the way you're supposed to do it on the social media channels,
Yeah,
kids.
go figure that one, Jeff, right?
Oh, my gosh. We'll get to that. I don't want to
you
give the
picked
whole
up
thing
the
away,
phone?
but we talked for probably an hour, and we're both late for our next calls, and we had to capture some of that for this episode too. And I love what you're doing because you're out there. You've put yourself in a position to make people respond to you. You are getting people to see you, hear you, and appreciate you in different ways. And this is the last interview for our March theme of prospecting, and I can't think of anybody else to bring it home quite like you're going to be able to today. So thank you for being here.
No, it's awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it as well. And, it's just so interesting because, before we were talking about, your podcast, my podcast, and so forth. But even if we get before that, I look back at my journey over the last couple of years and I go, hey, I can't believe who would have thought 2 years ago I'd be on anybody's podcast. But
right.
it just goes to show you, and I think this is the difficult thing with salespeople is I mean, Jeff, I throw it out there pretty hard. I do it for a reason. Am I gonna tick somebody off occasionally? Absolutely, we all are. But it's done to get people to think. And I'm proof out there. I'm a 53-year-old guy that stepped out of the copier world and into coaching and mentoring and training just a couple years ago. And I stay true to how I throw it out at sales reps is how do you expect to get noticed in a marketplace when nobody knows you exist?
And there's so many of you, right? Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, you've done it.
Well, I can't say I've done it because I think we can always learn every single day, and I've just never stopped learning. I mean, that's what kind of drives me, and I'll get into what really drives me later. But that's the thing that I took to heart when I came out of a backwards channel, traditional laggard industry like the copier channel, where 1999 is still alive and well, even though it's 2018. And I love the channel. It provided well for me, my family. I cut my teeth in it, and I just never looked back. But then I looked back at, it's just difficult. Sales in general is difficult.
It's hard.
It's hard. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that sales reps aren't throwing information at them, right? This is dead. This is dead. This is dying, right? To me, the only thing that's dying is when you don't use all the information that's out there, and that's your own fault.
So it's interesting to me, Larry, when you talk about your experience in the copier industry, that someone with your level of energy and experience and ability to convey what motivates salespeople, what motivates buyers to buy from certain salespeople, that you were able to maintain that level of knowledge and communication skill when it could have been just as easy to sit back and get absorbed into a kind of a slower moving market. How did you stay on top of it?
Well, I'll go back to my very first sales manager, who was it was the worst experience I ever had, because this was probably 1988. And I was trained old school. So Jeff, you probably know what old school is, right? It's the old ways of doing things. I carried a bag, I carried brochures. Now I'm really going to date myself, but I carried a briefcase full of brochures with a stapled business card to it. And I was taught that you can't come back to the office until you've passed out all of these and collected 50 business cards and found at least one or two people to talk to.
Wow. That's, I got to say though, it's not a whole lot different about how I grew up in selling 15 years ago. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. There's still a lot of people doing that, Larry. I'll tell you, and that's where I think you're going with this, is that, there's still a lot of people carrying business cards, stapling brochures. Here's my, if your brochure could sell for you, why do they need you?
Yeah, and I think I used that experience that really motivated me. That motivated me, and my dad motivated me. And my dad's a retired rocket scientist for the U.S. Air Force. He did liquid jet propulsion. Whole nother conversation. So I had to live up to expectations of, a guy who had a PhD by the time he was 20 from NYU and Cornell, and then all of a sudden I got to drop the bomb on my dad. Hey, guess what? I can't figure out what I want to do. I have a couple degrees, but I think I'm going to go sell copiers for a living. And he goes. And he goes, what? So my first sales manager motivated me. My dad motivated me. And the biggest thing is my dad taught me how to be accountable to yourself, because I wasn't getting it from my sales managers. I think what really lit my fire throughout my whole entire career that I spent in the copier channel was, if you can't hold yourself accountable, then who can? Because I went from being let down from one manager to another manager to another manager. I had to learn how to play the rules of the game, right? I had to be respectful of their position. I had to be respectful of the company. But I was just one that I was learning. I was always reading books. I was always driving myself, because I always have the saying, I didn't want to be looking up when I was at the bottom of the totem pole. I wanted to be looking down as I was on top of the totem pole. So what drove me was just an insane appetite to learn and always be better and figure out who I was. That's kind of what motivated me. And that's what drove me to, once I started figuring out how to integrate social, that's what just was, to me, it was just jet fuel on an old traditional way to go to business.
Perfect segue there. I was going to ask you, because you talk about a laggard channel. You talk about people who, any channel can get laggard when people want to sit and stay in their ways, right? And, when you think about traditionally, you look at the turnover in copier sales, you look in, the office solutions, and, listen, every office needs solutions, right? But I mean, there's just, there's such a massive inertia that needs to be changed. And then digital comes along and you've got these new channels and new ways to connect. How do you revitalize an industry that represents a boat the size of the Titanic trying to change? How do you get a boat that big to turn on a dime? It's really, really difficult to do, but you've been able to use those channels to really engage and connect with people, and you've just the effectiveness that you've had with a new trick in an old market is remarkable, and I think that's been a huge differentiator for you. How did you get really motivated to utilize those channels, and then how long did it take before you started getting some traction?
It really wasn't that hard. Because I think at the core of sales, and it's really interesting. I was out working with a sales team. This isn't too long ago, and one of their tenured reps, afterwards we went off to a breakout session, and he was telling me that he has a hard time driving conversation with people. Right? We'll just say it's an introvert. We'll just use that word as an example. And I go, why are you in sales? Right? Why are you in sales if you have a difficult time talking to people?
Wow, that's a good question.
But I flipped it, because I always loved talking to people. So I just found out that the more I got to know somebody, the better off it was. The more I rolled up my sleeves, the more I just kept it genuine, authentic, and real, the more I got to know somebody. Then when I had to ask those difficult questions, it wasn't that difficult. But what I started to realize, and I'll pick on the copier channel for a bit, because it's probably no different than in some of these other channels. It's a business that has a ton of recurring revenue. So a salesperson can work real hard for a couple of years, develop a lease portfolio, and then guess what happens? they sit back and all they do is renew and they renew and they renew. So to me, that's not being in sales. That's just being an order taker. And I'll argue that point till the cows come home on this one, that, you're not selling when all you're doing is renewing leases. You're replacing something with something else. So what always drove me is every assignment I had was net new. So I had to pay attention to developing business. And to me, a non-negotiable item as part of a sales rep is you got to be always developing business. I don't care if it's on your client base, it's new business. You got to continually be developing business. And if you can't do that, then get out of sales. It's my opinion.
Yeah.
Two things there that I want to touch on, and man, this may take more than one episode. So you hopped on introverts in sales, and
which I want to come back to, by the way.
I actually identify as an introvert, but I think there's an interesting kind of twist on that there. And the other thing is the kind of hunter versus the farmer conversation versus the order taker, because I think an order taker is also different than a farmer. I don't know where I want to go first, but what's the difference between a farmer and an order taker? Do you think there's a difference? Do you think there's I think that the best hunters look for a place to farm so that they have a home base to go and hunt from again. You know what I mean? That's the way I take it. But I mean, a lot of times there's, if you're an order taker, you're not in selling. And I would agree with that too. So I'm just, if you feel strongly about that, that might be an interesting thing.
I mean, I think it's a delicate balance of both, because I've read everything on the internet. Well, you only have hunters, right? They can only hunt. Well, they can't farm. Well, farmers can only farm, they can't hunt. You know what? And I always say there's a difference between a sales rep and a sales professional.
Yes.
And a sales professional will do all those things in its simplest format that a sales rep won't. So again, there were certain things that were just absolutely non-negotiable to me. Was I had to hunt for business. That's part of what you have to do as a sales rep. I took care of my own funnel, right? I didn't grow up in a time where I had a telemarketer. I sure didn't grow up in a time where I had, BDRs and SDRs and ADRs and every other acronym you want to attach to a glorified word of a telemarketer, right? But that's just my opinion. So I had to develop my own funnel. I had to develop my own relationships. So, there's that whole saying, you kill what you eat, right? You hunt, you kill it, and you eat it. Well, it's the same thing as I hunted for business, but then I had to farm that business that I hunted.
Yeah.
So I always have the saying, I'd go wide and deep in my accounts. So I think a sales professional learns how to throw on their hunter's hat, and they have to learn how to put on their farmer's hat.
Well, and there's hunting within a farming account too, right?
God,
so if you're a national account leader, then, you should be nurturing what you've already developed. And then you're also looking for, okay, what's the next new opportunity? Because reality is your position is only as good as you are distancing yourself from your next competitor. So they're still walking in the door and trying to oust you. You have to keep hunting to make sure that you've got a new angle or a new channel or something in that particular account.
If you like us, tell us. Send us a message at The Why and the Buy on Twitter, or leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you got this podcast.
Jeff and I are beyond excited that you choose to spend your time with us each week. We'd love to hear from you. And we thank you again for your support and for your connection.
So, because I think this is a great time for question. I'm going to throw it back at you guys, because I have my own answer. Is why do you think tenured reps find it so hard to clearly define hunter versus farmer? And why is it that a tenured rep thinks that they have stripes on their arms and they don't want to hunt anymore?
Christy, you want to jump on this one first?
Yeah. So we were talking earlier about the Ryan Holiday book, Ego is the Enemy, which I loved. And it really speaks to this particular element, which is success can actually be a numbing drug. So you've been successful for all these years. Maybe you got lucky, because let's just face it, sometimes sales is also luck. You were in the right place at the right time. The industry was prime. And then you just sat back and you collected the check. Sometimes I think salespeople get too far into the weeds on operations. Instead of letting operations handle that, they try to own everything. And then that just continues to numb them even further. So you can't have the sharp eyes and claws that you need to go out and truly hunt. You want to be a bird of prey, you have to be able to do all of those things. You can't do that if you're kind of trying to keep the wheels on the bus and manage operations.
Well, yeah, and even farther is you can't hunt if all you've hunted is one or two relationships inside that account, and that's a whole nother story. So I mean, let's not think of hunting in terms of hunting for an order, but I'll challenge salespeople out there: hunt for relationships and build credibility inside your current accounts who hopefully know, like, and trust you the best. Because I will guarantee this, because I've seen it happen time and time and time again. Watch what happens when a tenured, seasoned sales rep loses one of their top 5 accounts.
Do they bounce back?
Because of fear, ego, complacency, and all that. Oh my God, Jeff! Not only, I mean, they can't bounce right back. They go into a death spiral, and then they start blaming everybody else, as opposed to, look in the mirror, pal. It's all your fault.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to stay on brand with my answer to this question, and I'm going to say that a lot of it depends on what their why is. And I think there's a lot of salespeople out there who have gotten into selling specifically because they can make a lot of money doing it. If they do it well, they get really, really good at doing it, and they make the money, and then they find out how tired they are for not having the right purpose and chasing the dollar. They find out that they've got enough money and it doesn't motivate them so much anymore. And then, to echo Christie's point, the ego kind of gets in the way, and they believe it's always going to stay there, so they don't need to get any more, because beyond a certain point, and this is the problem with money being defined, the primary motivator, is that at a certain point you have enough money. The difference between making $10 million a year and $11 million a year, which is really hard to do as a bag-carrying sales rep, by the way. That's why I'm just picking those two arbitrary numbers. This is not exactly coming from my own personal experience here. The difference between 10 and 11 million in a year is negligible. Over a certain point, you can pretty much just do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it. And then even if you have to make 15 million because 10 million isn't enough to leave a legacy for your kids and their kids and their kids, then your primary motivator is not the money, it's leaving a legacy and stability for generations, right? I mean, so that's even a different thing. So I think if you're not in tune to solving problems, collaborating, and really connecting and being a solution-oriented salesperson, if the only solution you're trying to find is how you're going to pay for that new car or whatever, then that kind of gets stale, I think. And in a long enough timeline, that motivation is not going to be backed up with activity.
I mean, you brought up some really great points, and you brought up your why and things like that. I mean, the things that really motivated me more than anything was my reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, being a bag carrying, we use that term, being a bag carrying salesperson inside the copier channel, you're never going to make $10 million, right? But I remember the benchmark was $100,000, right? So, I mean, that's a lot of money for the average person out there.
Yeah.
So once you get to, you got to do certain things on a daily, weekly, monthly basis as a salesperson in order to get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you get to that point, okay, well then what do I need to do to get 25% more and 30% more? Only because I knew kind of where my cap was at.
Sure.
But my whole why was my reputation. I enjoyed driving conversation, but more importantly, it's the art of giving back. And I always say, in its truest, simplest format, sales is about the art of the help. You're helping people solve business problems and challenges.
Mm-hmm.
You're helping, even if you can't help them with that certain solution, then you better be able to pull a personal relationship out of your back pocket and bridge that with somebody else. And what I always share with people, the best, where I really learned this was giving back inside my community. That's where I think I became a better sales rep. Mm-hmm. And then sales professional was the art of giving back to people. And that means volunteering and all that. And I always have this motto. I took it to heart as a sales rep, is I always offered to help without asking for anything in return, because I knew at a certain point in time it would come back.
Yeah.
And I never overcomplicated sales. right? I always said, hey, if you want to overcomplicate sales and turn it into rocket science, I'll introduce you to my dad because, right? All I wanted to know when I was going to school was 2 + 2 is 4. I didn't want a 45-minute dissertation and the scientific reason why 2 + 2 is 4.
Right.
But I just knew that I just went to work every day with the mindset that I was going to build relationships and offer to help and stay true and genuine to who I was. That was my why. And then over time, my why morphed as I started to figure out what my brand was. And I think the biggest thing is, because I was telling Chrissy, I really want to hone in on this, especially in a traditional laggard channel. And there's more traditional laggard channels than just the copier channel, even though I grew up in it, make fun of it and things like that. I hired a business coach about 12 years ago. I invested $10,000 of my own money 12 years ago to hire a business coach. And the single best thing he taught me was how to brand myself.
Yeah.
I had no freaking clue what a brand was. But now everybody has a brand. We just don't know what to do with it. And 12 years ago, when I figured out what to do with it, how I can articulate my value proposition, how I can articulate why I'm doing what I'm doing with conviction, I could be concise with it, with passion behind it, then people bought into it. Mm-hmm. And I shared it everywhere I went because I knew the more people that knew my story and the more people that I helped, guess what started to happen? This.
Yeah.
They started telling the Larry Levine story.
Yeah.
Because I think sales has got a black eye to begin with. We're already behind the 8 ball before we even meet with these people. So yes. Let's just face it. And that was just the approach that I took to the sales world I grew up in. I was already behind the 8 ball. I already knew that. But if I was going to rise above the sea of sameness, especially in this channel that I grew up in, I had to do things differently. And I had to rapidly kind of shift gears. So one of the best things that I did is I took my top 5 clients and I went back to them and I asked them this question. And I'll urge the listeners, if they want to do the same, you'll be amazed what you learn, is tell me the top 10 things you don't like about salespeople and tell me the 10 things you like about salespeople.
Yep. That's powerful.
And then you know what I did? And I never, I never complicated anything. Still to this day, I don't, Jeff and you and I have talked about it. I don't complicate my approach to how we integrate social into a traditional sales channel because it's not rocket science. But all I did is that all the lists of things that they gave me that they hated about salespeople, I just flipped it on its head and did the complete opposite. Mm-hmm. So when I was having a conversation with Jeff, as I was building my brand and sharing how I can help is, Jeff, I expect at a certain point in time, you've probably run into these salespeople that list them out 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I'm sure you have.
Yep.
They'll say, yeah. Well, how'd that make you feel? Well, let me share what it would be like if and when we decide to do business together. This is what you can expect.
It's interesting too. You've heard me say this on the podcast too. But ask your best customers why they buy from you. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and you will be surprised at what you learn because you go in, you got someone you've had a relationship with, you've been doing business with them for years. And then you say, oh, yeah, well, they're clearly buying. I think it's because of this and this and this. And it's assumption. There are assumptions. And I'd say that, 95% of the people out there make the assumption that their customer buys for X reason. About 15% of them will be right because they're fairly in tune to how things work. 5% of them, 5% of people don't actually know, right? They actually know, so they don't need to ask, or they know because they have asked. And 80% of the people are assuming wrong. And as soon as you can close that gap and from the assumption of why your best salespeople buy and actually asking them the question, one, you deepen the credibility in the relationship by asking such a question that puts you in a vulnerable position and then allows them to be vulnerable and tell you as well. But now you learn the real reasons. You will be surprised, and it will change your approach to selling because you are then going to angle your approach not toward features and benefits of the shiny 3-color brochure that you have, but really having a conversation about the other things that you bring to the table that you can't print on a brochure. because
No,
they're intangible.
and you bring up some really great points, because this is my challenge to salespeople all over the place. I don't care what channel you all are in. Is, we talk about relationships, we talk about credibility, we talk about value. To me, I think these are all buzzwords that salespeople use because they really truly don't know.
They don't mean anything.
Well, right. And I said, okay, so let's set credibility and value aside. Let's just talk about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Because, salespeople got big fat egos, right? And so forth. So they're going to go, I got great relationships with all my accounts, and I'll call BS on them, because how do you truly have great relationships with anybody in these accounts if you only see them every 3 or 4 months, or when a problem exists, and you're not even connected to them on social, you're not driving any educational material there, you're not creating top of mind awareness? How do you honestly can look yourself in the mirror and say you have great relationships with your clients? That's, that's a false positive, or whatever you want to call it, scientifically. So I always tell, in fact, I did it just recently with a sales team, is, you know what, take your top 5 clients and go face to face with them and ask them, what's the value that I bring to your organization? Boom. And don't say a word. Mm-hmm. And I don't care if you're biting your tongue and your lips bleeding and there's blood all over the,
you causing a scene.
You can't, right? But it's on all seriousness, you can't say a word, because that's, to me personally, that's the litmus test for salespeople, is if your clients who you say know, like, and trust you, if you can't go, I call it the pucker up or the gut check question. If you can't say, what's the value that I brought to your organization within 10 or 15 seconds, if they can't clearly say it, there's red flags all over the place. Yep. And then if you don't know the value that you bring to your clients, then how the heck can you go out there and prospect for new business if you don't even know the value that you're driving to your new client or your current clients?
Right.
That's right.
Mind blowing.
Yeah. Well, it's all about, we were talking about building your story brand, right? It's about making the customer the hero of the story. It's not about you, it's about them. And you can't do that if you don't really have the right information in their language.
No, and you know what? And I don't know, here's the soft heart in me right now is going to come out, and it's just not all salespeople's fault.
Oh,
right? So
you want to make sure everybody feels good before we leave.
You know what? I want to make sure that I'm pointing fingers at everybody on this one. But you know what? But because I think, and rightfully so, right? Salespeople are getting a bad rap, but they bring it upon themselves. But we also have to start paying attention to the sales managers in these organizations, the VP of sales in these organizations, executive management in these organizations, because they've fostered the behavior, they've fostered that environment, and they've allowed these salespeople to get away with it for so long that they foster that culture, and it's hard to change.
Yeah,
and quite frankly, if a sales rep's making $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year, and all they're doing is flipping their base, and you're asking them to do one thing beyond what they don't want to do, then what? They're going to go. And most people don't want to lose those guys, right?
Right. Oh, we can't lose him. We can't lose her. She'll take all the business with her. Will she?
Maybe, right? and that's the chance you had to take. But I had a difficult conversation with a sales leader not too long ago, and I said, what would happen if you replaced your top sales rep in your organization? Not to say that you are, right, but what would happen if you replaced that top sales, that one who's driving the most sales, right? They've been the number one salesperson in your organization for year over year for a while. What would happen if you replaced it with 2 salespeople that were eager, coachable, and were hungry to grow business? Would you lose any of that business? And they said, probably not. And I said, okay, then I think you've answered your question.
Yes.
It's probably going out in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And it's one thing when that top sales rep is an active contributor and is looking to make the others, around them better and things like that. And it's another thing when that top contributor is just a bear and is out on an island and does not play well with others, and is those types of salespeople become cancers to organizations very, very quickly.
Well, yeah, and because obviously we're dancing around prospecting with various levels of salespeople, but why don't you ask, and I'll throw this out, and I always like just ruffling feathers, not that I want to make people upset. I just want to get them to start thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
More than anything else is, the behavior patterns of a sales rep who's been in their industry for 10 or 15 years is a whole lot different than the behavior patterns when they first started.
Mm-hmm.
When they first started, they didn't know what to expect other than they did what their sales manager told them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, 10 or 15 years later, they do the complete opposite of what their sales manager tells them to do because they think they've earned the right to do it, right?
Yeah.
I'm hitting quota, right? Or I'm busting quota. Well, to me, if you don't have a blend of new business and current business, then you really aren't busting quota. But that's a pet peeve of mine, that you call yourself the top sales rep when 100% of the business that you've done is all base flipping.
Someone asked me a couple of years ago how things were going, and I said, team's having a really good year. There's almost everybody's hitting their quota. And he looks back at me and says, "Sounds like nobody's quota was high enough."
So this goes back a year or two ago. I'm flying off on tangents, but sorry.
It's all good.
But this goes back a year or two ago, and I had a conversation with a solutions guy inside of the world that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And Larry goes, I want your honest answer to this question. Would you award a top salesperson of the year? Would you award the top salesperson of the year for somebody who met their plan and flipped 100% of their base? Okay. Or would you award salesperson of the year to the person who came in second, but 90% of what they did was net new? And I said, well, it depends on how you rank people. But to me, and this is just my warped way of thinking, I'll give more accolades to the person who drove net new than the person who drove 100% flipping their base. Because were they truly selling that, or were they just order taking it? Are you follow where I'm driving with this?
I do. I remember you put that out on LinkedIn probably 8 or 9 months ago, and I chimed in. I think to bring it all back, I think with the rocket scientist style answer of, well, it depends on where the priorities of the organization lie, and do you want just revenue or do you want new sources of revenue and all these other things. So then, and what's interesting is when you look at the awards that get handed out at these national sales meetings at the beginning of every year or the beginning of the fiscal year or whatever, they clearly tell you where the organization places all of their importance. If it's all about revenue, then that guy who flipped his base and doesn't get to do, didn't really bring on anybody new, just happened, all the things lined up for renewals all at the same time, then, hey, great. Then that's fine. It's all about the revenue, but you're not going to incentivize anybody to do anything differently. And when you align your priorities as an organization with the priorities of your salespeople, that's when real results happen. But I also have the sales managers who come to me and say, man, my guys, they're all fat and happy and they're not doing a whole lot, and I just want to get more out of them. And I say, hey, are they hitting their numbers? Well, yeah, I mean, for the most part, we're growing like crazy and everything. I just don't think they're working very hard, and I don't like what I'm seeing. It's like, listen, you give them an objective to hit and they hit it, they're doing everything that you've asked them to do. If you don't like what they're doing, then ask them to do something else and see if the behavior changes. And then you've got something to talk about and work within. But there are a lot of companies that are in that kind of frame of mind too, to where it's like, well, this is the way we do things. And to your point, Larry, it's about the sales executives and the sales managers to not decide to drive the change in behavior, but just to try to pull strings and shout orders.
Well, you have to set incentives, right? I mean, and incentives are going to be at varying levels. So, from a business management leadership perspective, both are actually very important, because you can't run a business on all net new business. You need some of that residual, but you've got to figure out what's going to, what is it you want to reward, and are the behaviors moving in the right direction? So, I think there's maybe a little bit of both even. But if you're not going to reward the guy that flipped his base, then you've got to figure out how to incentivize him so that he doesn't make all of his money on flipping his base.
Yeah,
right?
and obviously this podcast isn't about compensation plans.
Yes, right, sure,
And so forth. But I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, and gosh, man, I've written blog posts about it and so forth because we make so many analogies inside the sales world to the sports world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's articles upon articles that compare, right? We want to find salespeople that were ex-athletes, right, because of their work ethic and their mindset and things like that. But how many salespeople out there now have the mindset of a sports athlete? Not very many that I've come across.
Right. Right.
And it's a big, huge problem. And it's just not a sales problem. It's a management problem. It's an ownership problem that they treat the LeBron James of their sales team a whole lot differently than they treat the rookie of their sales team. And they hold these people to different degrees of standards. And to me, if I ever got back into where I had my own company and things like that, and I'm playing make believe, but if I started my own company and I started a sales team and it was a blend of, rookies and youth and tenured and well past tenured salespeople, I'd hold them to all the same set of standards, because to me, it just sends a bad message. And I think that's the biggest single reason why the current state of prospecting inside organizations is so disjointed, because all the newbies, all they do is prospect. That's all they do, right? They don't have any business unless they've been given some. And then they watch the behaviors of all the other tenured sales reps who sporadically, if at all, prospect, right?
Right.
That's the tough thing. But there's not too many salespeople out there that hold themselves to a non-negotiable standard. Says, you know what, I must prospect every single day. The only way tenured sales rep, and let's just face it, I hate using the expression, but it is what it is. The only time that tenured sales rep is going to prospect is when they got squat in their funnel and there's nobody to flip. Then they got to figure out what it's like to prospect, and they suck at it because they forgot how to practice.
Yeah.
Well, fear is an incredible motivator.
Right?
Yes, it is.
I mean, I stink at golf, and I gave the golf game up a long time ago, because how can you get any better if you don't practice?
Yeah.
I still try to play at golf.
Well, I gave that. I love watching it. I just can't play it. But it's the same reason that today is me. I had a non-negotiable item with me when I started Social Sales Academy, is I had to prospect. Nobody knew who I was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jeff and Christie didn't know who I was. Half of the world didn't know who I was. So I had to make a non-negotiable pact with me that every single day I had to do something to generate awareness of who I was in a marketplace that nobody knew I existed.
Mm-hmm.
So my challenge to sales professionals out there is, how are you marketing yourself outside the 20 accounts that you're personally managing? Because if I throw a freeze on those accounts and say, Christy, you can't sell to any of these accounts, I don't care if our business suffers, what are you going to do? You'll probably take exit, you'll look for the next job opportunity where you can meet somebody else's base.
Yep.
That's why I just have a strong conviction around prospecting that, you can't call yourself a sales professional unless you prospect. And you got to prospect inside your client base, outside your client base, and I know Noodleberg's been on, your podcast, it's the same thing. He's always out there networking. I'm always out there networking. Yeah. I'm always sharing my story, because you never know who Christy knows who might know somebody that leads me to Jeff.
Right.
That's exactly right. And it's and that's the thing that a lot of people are overwhelmed when it comes to social selling and prospecting in the digital sphere, and just how do you bridge that gap? What's the biggest mistake that people make when using digital media to prospect?
Well, I think the biggest mistake is they're paying attention to all the noise that's out there. I mean,
there's a lot.
And there's a ton of noise. There's a ton of noise out there. I've kind of, the old Frank Sinatra song, My Way. I've always done it my way. Mm-hmm. And I haven't paid attention to the noise because I taught myself how to use LinkedIn and I think, and for one thing is, I don't encourage salespeople to get lost in the weeds of LinkedIn, because everyone thinks social selling is LinkedIn, and it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to me, a non-negotiable item for a salesperson is you must have a presence on that platform.
You
You must
exist.
look good. You have to exist, and so forth. But if you can't outbound prospect, if you don't have the core foundations down of traditional outbound prospecting, if you're not true to yourself, if you don't understand your why, if you can't articulate a value proposition, if you can't get engaged in a business conversation, is social selling going to help, guys?
No.
Yeah.
It's
If you're
just
not a
plausible
good salesperson,
deniability.
it doesn't change it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And that's my argument. Yes, we do live in a digital business world. Yes, the sales world's transforming. All businesses are transforming. But I go back to how I work with salespeople and how I internalized all this is rocket science or simple. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Larry, this conversation, we could take this all day, and we'll probably stop recording and then keep talking because that's just kind of the people that we are. But what would you tell our audience is your why? Why do you do what you do every day?
Well, it all goes back to when I hired that business coach, and when I started seeing the struggles of how hard it was to capture the attention of Jeff or capture the attention of Christie. People are hiding behind voicemails. People are hiding behind emails. It was so hard. And this goes back probably mid 2000s to really capture the attention of somebody. It was even hard to capture the attention of my current clients, right?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that when I hired my business coach, that was my why moment. We'll just call it my rock bottom moment, even though I wasn't at rock bottom. But when I hired my business coach and he taught me how to brand myself and he pulled out what I knew was inside me, that I can now articulate that out into the business community.
Yeah.
And I started seeing success with it. I go, this is kind of cool. And I wanted to drive people to my profile and my platform as much as possible because that was a 24/7 just window shopping show for me. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started seeing success of how much more I was connecting in a deeper meaning with my current clients and how far I was getting inside their networks because they were really starting to understand who I was. That's where I kept it simple. But when I could start building a relationship, and I always say, there's a relationship funnel and a sales funnel.
Mm-hmm.
Most sales reps, mismanage a sales funnel. They don't even know what a relationship funnel is. So
Right.
when I started learning my why and my brand and telling my story, that was building relationships. And then as I started doing this, obviously the credibility came into the factor and so forth. But now, when I hopped out of the channel, the copier channel, just a couple of years ago, my second why was I saw in a traditional laggard sales channel how backwards things were and how sales reps were struggling the same way I was 10 and 12 years ago. That I said, you know what, it's all about giving back. Well, yeah, it's all about giving back and I got to make money at it too.
Mm-hmm.
But I set the Social Sales Academy up just for a simple reason of keeping it simple by helping people bridge traditional and modern in a way that was understandable and digestible that didn't confuse the heck out of them. And I think, that's the biggest thing that's out there is there's a lot of noise that overcomplicates social. But to me, I'll go back to Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That book was written 80 years ago, and the core foundation of it is still there.
Yeah.
It's building relationships and changing the way people think. So pre-Google, pre-internet, pre-everything, the only way I could change, build relationships and change the way people think was face-to-face and on the phone. That was it. Now, if we fast forward to 2018, you're still building relationships and changing the way people think. We have 25 different ways to do it. To me, I just got to know 2 or 3 really well.
Boom.
And that was it.
Yep.
So, my whole why now is I just love sharing my story. I love helping salespeople integrate social into their sales process. But more importantly, everybody has a brand. Everybody has a story. They just don't know how to tell it. I love pulling the story out of them. And it's tough. It is the single toughest thing for salespeople to do is to have their story told and articulate it correctly. They may be able to do it to their peers and their spouse or their significant other, but how do you really articulate that why? And how do you really articulate that story with conviction? It's not by getting somebody else to write your story. It's about you spending the time to self-reflect and become self-aware who you are, to write your own story. And that's what I enjoy doing the most.
So Larry Levine and the Social Sales Academy, how can people get a hold of you? How do you want people to get a hold of you?
Actually, you know what? If you want, you can pick up the phone. I'd be more than happy to give you my phone number, but I don't know how many times I can answer my phone.
The thousands and thousands of listeners that are listening right now.
That's right.
Larry Levine is giving out his phone number.
That's right.
I mean, I could. You know what? We're going to test this, Jeff, okay?
Okay.
This is my cell phone number. It's 805.
I'm writing it down.
907-5947. And I would like to see how many listeners will actually pick up the phone and call me, because I love having conversations with people.
That's a challenge.
That is awesome. Did you guys hear that?
But they can find me at LinkedIn, right? My address on LinkedIn is Larry Levine 1992.
Mm-hmm.
They can find more about me on my website at socialsalesacademy.net. I podcast with a very good and close buddy of mine, Daryl Amy, Selling from the Heart podcast. You can find us there. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram, and that's it.
And
Love
it.
Twitter and Instagram, my address is Larry1Levine. It's the same for Twitter as it is for Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
I love sharing knowledge. I love blogging. I love my podcast. I love being on this podcast. I love this conversation because I just like talking sales.
Yeah.
And I don't like talking sales where it becomes overcomplicated and too much theory in it. It's just, you know what? I did the same thing as a sales rep every single day for 28 years in the Copier channel, and I'm doing the same thing now. No different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. And you're going to be in the ATL here in April as well at the Outbound Conference. You're going to be on stage, right?
That I'm still pinching myself on, Chrissy. So I know I'll see you there.
Yes.
But, I'm just honored that Jeb Blunt, Mike Weinberg, Mark Hunter, and Anthony Iannarino asked me to speak there. I still don't feel I'm deserving of it, but you know what? I'm going to have a blast sharing my story and sharing why, as a 53-year-old guy, I've integrated social into what I do. Having a blast doing it.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to be an amazing conference. So if you're here, and about half of our listeners are from the Atlanta area, so this is the ideal audience. Definitely go to outboundconference.com. I did check it earlier today, and there are still some tickets left. So you can see Larry and several others that you've even heard on the podcast as well at the conference, and find me somewhere in the audience too.
You're not going to give us your phone number too, Christy? You're not just going to
I will. Here, let me give that out right this moment.
I'm scared to death that I just now have thrown my cell number out there. But do not delete my number out of this podcast, because I really want to see how many people will actually call, because the phone still works, guys.
Awesome. That's a great statement to make. That is an awesome statement to make.
Yes, I love it. I think that's awesome. Thank you so much, Larry. We really appreciate you coming and joining us. And I know you're writing a book, so we expect to see you back here when you're ready to release that book.
And that book, and it'll be sometime this year, and it's Selling from the Heart: How Your Authentic Self Sells You.
That's awesome. Love it.
Christy, Larry knows his why.
That's right, because when you know your why, your hows and your whats get much better.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon.
I told you once, I've told you twice. I told myself it doesn't matter.
99% of your success is rooted in your understanding and subsequent mastery of the fundamentals. I don't care what it is that you're doing. I was introduced to the fundamental principles of sales when I read Jeffrey Gitomer's Little Red Book of Selling back in 2005. I actually bought it and gave it away 4 or 5 times before I finished it myself. Now Christy and I want to give you something. All of those lessons and so many more are now interactive and available online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year on the Gitomer Learning Academy. It has never been easier or more accessible to invest 10 minutes a day in your sales success. Go to GitomerLearningAcademy.com to check it out, and send us an email to gla@thewhyandthebuy.com, and we'll get you set up with a free 2-week trial. Christy and I were looking for a house band for the podcast, and we were told the Roots were busy, so we found the next best thing. They're called Haskins, and they are gigging regularly in southeastern Michigan and all the time at HaskinsMusic.com. Go check them out.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.